Welcome. About events, get your technical questions answered and contribute to the community forum, and of course, attend the weekly online Global Passive House Happy Hour. Now, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Well, welcome back to a special episode of the Passive House podcast. How are you doing, Zach?
I'm doing great. How are you, Matthew?
I'm pretty good. I don't know if you ever listen to reruns of podcasts. I subscribe to quite a few, and occasionally it annoys me. But in preparing for today's interview, I actually re-listened to our feature interview, and I was pleasantly surprised how much I got out of listening to it again. It's maybe I'm just a slow learner, but because it was my interview in the first place. It was my interview in the first place.
Yeah, right. I'm right there with you. And listen, I think it's an encore episode. It's not a
encore.
Rerun. It's an encore.
Yes, I like
this. This is definitely an encore because we took a look back at all the episodes that have been produced in the last year, and it's been 50 regular episodes plus a bunch of bonus ones. There's a lot of amazing interviews. So we've selected for everybody some of the best, and it wasn't easy.
Yeah. Well, let's before we get into what we're doing, we've got a few people to thank because we're still producing and putting these podcasts out there. So who helps us do that?
Yeah, so our founding sponsors are 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxtingui Architects, Glavel Foam Glass Gravel, Minutair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification Units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, RDH Building Science, Rockwool North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Our champion sponsor is SIGA, and our stakeholder partner is NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. So thanks to all of those sponsors for making the podcast happen.
Nice. So we are on you're on a bit of a break. Things are in summer break and heading to fall for August. So we're taking a little bit of time out from our regular schedule, but using this opportunity to look back, as you say, and bring you some encore episodes with some of our favorite and some of your favorite interviews, some of our most popular episodes. And the first interview for this encore series is Robyn Wark, who I interviewed. This was episode number 36. And Robyn, she's a sustainability strategist, partnership builder, coach on low carbon communities. And she's also an award winner, winning awards from the Real Estate Foundation of British Columbia, Federation of Canadian Municipalities. I struggled with that word the first time around. I'm still struggling with it. The Canadian Institute of Planners and the Planning Institute of British Columbia. This story is all about the step code, and I'm really excited about this. I still am. I think it's just such an obvious way to do things, and nothing's changed. So I think it's still really, really valuable. So here is my chat with Robyn Wark from BC Hydro. Thank you very much, Robyn, for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you on the show because I know that for myself, I've been pretty excited about the step code ever since I heard about that. But before we get into the details of that, tell us a little bit about
BC Hydro and what you do there and what your role is.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's great to chat to you. So I work for BC Hydro in our conservation and energy management group. So as a utility, we have a goal set by the province to be able to meet 66% of all new growth through demand side management, so through conservation. So that's been in place for many years. And so there's different ways that we can get conservation. We can put incentives in place like fridge buyback. We can do programs with industrial customers, commercial customers, etc. But perhaps one of the most cost-effective and useful things we can do to back all that up is to put codes in place so that we lock in those savings that we're seeing through those market leaders and just put them as the laws of the land, if you will. So our group is all around working with industry and government to work out regulations that can be put in place for green buildings. And now with more climate goals being provided by the government, green transportation as well. So using low carbon electricity for transportation and buildings.
Did you say fridge buyback?
Yeah, you don't have that in New Zealand?
Well, we have a lot of encouragement of people getting. So what tends to happen is, it's a brilliant idea, because what tends to happen is there's a promotion about upgrading fridges, but then people just keep the old one as a spare in the garage, and then you just got two fridges. So is that what I think it is? You take old fridges.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, we have a whole range of residential programs, from like behavior programs, like consumer rebates on like equipment, etc. And we've had in the past a fridge buyback plan where we take clunky old fridges and buy them back.
BC Hydro is a power company, right?
Yeah, that's right. We're the Crown Corporation here in BC, providing electricity to most of the province.
So now most companies want to increase the demand for what they sell. Why is that different for a utility? Why are you trying to encourage people to use less of what you sell?
Yeah, that blows people's minds a bit, doesn't it? It's a requirement from the government that we're a growing population, so we have a growing demand. But rather than build new infrastructure, we have to limit the amount of new infrastructure we build by instead investing in conservation. So it's called demand side management, and we've been set targets from the government, and then we have to work out how we meet those targets, and that's through our conservation programs.
And I think that's a key concept, because it's not unique to BC Hydro. My understanding is that's the situation that you're in, where it's an entity which basically has a monopoly in that region, has some ownership by, in your case, the Crown or some sort of government ownership. That's a fairly common situation around the world, my understanding is.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not singular to government-owned utilities. There's private utilities as well that are also set these demand-side management goals, these conservation goals. And so they have a range of different programs. Again, often incentives giving to consumers, but increasingly we're seeing utilities looking at how they can support regulatory change.
And as well as that sort of directive from above, is it also of benefit to you as a company for electricity usage to be a little bit more consistent and predictable, rather than having lots of highs and lows?
Yeah, so I mean, it's the most cost-effective way of meeting new demand is through conservation, like flattening that down. It's typically we have cost tests, but it typically costs less to get people to use less than to build new infrastructure. So there's that benefit. Your question around sort of peaks and how our electricity is used, we're looking at it increasingly. It's called capacity-based demand-side management, where we look at how can we influence the timing of the way that our electricity is used, so that we don't have to build as much infrastructure, or we can be more strategic in our use of infrastructure. So that's certainly something that we and other utilities are looking at as well.
Now, as well as your work in that demand-side management, BC Hydro, you've been working as, you're currently co-vice chair of the Energy Step Code Council, and you've got a few other things on the go as well. How does that tie into your day job?
Yeah, it's all part of the day job. So part of our looking at how we can support regulations around energy conservation was through working with government around the building code. And when I say government, I don't just mean the provincial government, but also local governments who are administering the building codes and administering land use planning and building departments around compliance of codes. And so we've been doing that for 10, 12 years. And that's how my involvement in the Energy Step Code came about.
For those that haven't delved into it, how do you sum up what the Energy Step Code is?
It is a performance-based code. And an envelope first performance-based code. So making sure that you got a really solid envelope, airtight envelope first, and then you've got good equipment inside. And then it's a series of steps. So we identified what's the most efficient building that we should be building towards. And that's like a passive house level equivalent. So super energy efficient. And then we looked at our industry and said, well, how do we get there from here? Because at the moment we're not building anywhere near that, or this was developed about 5 years ago, and we weren't anywhere near that. And so others might have heard of it called a stretch code, where you put a series of steps between where you are now and where you want to get to, and sort of like as a pathway to get there. We used to call it the stretch code, and then we realized that we weren't necessarily going to get the uptake we wanted to, because stretch sounded like a bit scary or a bit like, oof, it sounds a bit dangerous. Whereas exactly, we didn't want to be painful.
Too much like exercise.
We wanted it to be more like, it's an easy step up a ladder to where we want to go to collectively. So we have a series of, it depends on the building type, anywhere between 3 to 5 steps to get from where we were back in 2017 through to where we need to get to as soon as possible. But we've said that the base building code will get there in 2032 here in BC.
Who's we when you talk about the people putting this together and what it actually means in terms of law or codes? Mm-hmm. Who's we?
Well, I guess officially it's the government. So it's the province is going to be putting it into the base building code, BC building code. So we've got 3 dates, 2022, which is next year, where the BC building code will be 20% above code, 2027, which is 40%, and then 2032, where it has to be 80%.
Above the current code.
Exactly, right. Exactly. But the whole idea of the STEP code was that local governments didn't have to wait for those dates. They could, because it's a roadmap and we know that's where the code's going to go, they were given permission to be able to adopt steps earlier than that. And similarly, utilities could choose to incent to different steps. Professional associations can do training for their members to different steps. People could market their buildings if they wanted to one of those steps. So it's really helpful to have that roadmap of where we're going to go to, so that we can use all the different levers of market transformation, and we can all be pointing to it in the same way and having that same conversation. So when I say we, I'm not just talking about government. I'm talking about the thousands and thousands of people here in BC who are involved in driving this market transformation. And that's overseen by the Energy Step Code Council, which I'm the co-vice chair of. So the leadership is myself, Zach May, who's the chair from the province, and then one of our leading builders here in BC, Bob Deeks.
Is there any particular incident or moment that you can point to as being the genesis of creating not just the code, but I guess the permission to create the code in the first place? Or was it the sort of culmination of a bunch of events? How did it come to exist?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've got a document that we wrote called the Lessons from the BC Energy Step Code. So as part of that, we did a bunch of interviews with all the different people who were involved in it. And you realized how many different parts of the story there were, if you will. So everyone sort of started it from a different angle, whether you were the city of Vancouver doing real leadership work as one jurisdiction within British Columbia. They were the one jurisdiction that could go above BC Building Code and just they've been real leaders here in the province. So that leadership work. Others would point to, we might point to our investment with local governments for the last decade or so, giving them the expertise to try and oversee better buildings here in BC. Perhaps the one that I'd point to, though, as perhaps the genesis was a white paper that was written in 2015, where we realized it was really difficult for utilities or for government to say, well, if you want to build better than code, what do you build to? And at the time, it was so confusing for me. Like, I'm not a super technical person. Like, do you point to, some people were pointing to Passive House, others Net Zero Energy Homes, LEED, Energy Star, better than ASHRAE, etc. And I didn't know how those all matched up and which one you should be pointing to and which ones performed better and how that would look in the marketplace. And so the whole idea of this white paper was to sift through all that and say, what do we in BC want to point to for those people who want to go above code? And so we were able to put together this proposal for a performance-based series of steps that people could point to. And it was a concept, so it was a white paper. And then as there was more and more desire for consistency here in BC, because different local governments were requiring different things or incenting different things, that group then came together. The province brought down a building act and said, hey, local governments, stop doing different things. And so then this group came together, a multi-stakeholder group, and said, okay, but fair enough that we do want to build better buildings. What should we be pointing to? And that was the genesis of the development of the STEP code.
And has there been any resistance from any areas, particularly manufacturers, product suppliers, developers, the traditional barriers that come up whenever you talk about building better because it sounds more expensive? Have there been some significant pushback?
I think one of the beauties of the process, because I've worked within local government, and the real challenge for a builder or developer, if you're in the middle of your project and all of a sudden the goalposts change and it doesn't work for your pro forma. When we came together to design the STEP code, it was really helpful that we weren't talking about something for next year. We were saying, this is by 2032, this is where we want to get to. And so it just let people kind of maybe chill a bit and think, nobody was objecting to the fact that we need to be building better buildings. The question was how and what does that transition look like and how do we do it affordably? Mm-hmm. And so I think with government's clarity that they did want to build that, then we were able to lean on our industry partners to help inform us. What would that look like? How fast should this go? What should the code include? What should it look like? How do you deal with compliance and certainty? How do you deal with everyone adopting it in the same sort of way? So there were definitely moments where no industry association particularly wants to be regulated. No builder's going to say, yeah, bring down a more stringent code. But I think that we were looking far enough out onto the horizon that it wasn't threatening any immediate projects. And instead, we were able to come together as a group and look at a reasonable pathway. And the people... Go, sorry.
Well, yeah, because the other thing is, how have you managed to lock that in, given that you've got election cycles as well? And that's often... The long-term horizon for a lot of policy is the next election. So how have you managed to get the government as well as the industry to lock in that longer-term view?
Yeah, I mean, I think So we did a lot of work with us as a group, which the group that became the Step Code Council, on getting everyone's voices heard, and then using everyone's voices to report out and to consult on what we were doing. So we had the Urban Development Institute or the Canadian Home Builders Association. They provided input into the code. And then we would, we as a utility, we would provide funding and support, or like consistent, like PowerPoint decks or whatever that looked like, whatever those groups needed, to be able to go and consult with their members on it. So I think that as you're hearing this from many different groups and many different voices, there's a sense of momentum that this is happening. It was actually, when we published the guide to or a recommended guide for rolling this out, it was the last act. We just got it signed off by one provincial party, and then there was an election and another provincial party came in. But I think it was getting all of those logos on the document, all that, we did costing studies, etc. That sense of, yes, we had consulted and people were on board, I think gave the government a sense of confidence to move forward. And then since then, well, we haven't got the 2022 code in place, but it is referenced in other government documents like climate action plans, etc., going forward. And then seeing the massive uptake of the code by the local governments here in BC, I think has made it so much easier at a provincial scale to be able to say yes, which I hope they will do for 2022.
There must have been a time early on when you're a bit nervous that you'd done all this work and post-election it could just all get thrown out.
I was more nervous that we wouldn't get it in front of the government to sign off before the election, to be honest.
Right.
Because, you got your political cycles, and I think it's one thing you really need to keep an eye on is when are the political cycles. And for us, it was both when the province could sign off on the policy before they called election, and then we had about a year before the local government elections. So how could we, maybe it was 18 months, how could we support as many local governments as possible in adopting or signing on to adopt the STEP code before there was a change of government? Like you want to see a launch, you want to see a momentum, you want to see an inevitability of like, wow, I guess we should because others are. And so I think because we had so many great local governments who were sitting around the table with really great capacity, who are really urging for a tool that they could use. Once it was given to them by the province, I was pretty confident that they would take it up, and that happened. Like within a year of it being made available to local governments, we had about 15 local governments, which made up over half of all building permits in BC, adopt it. So adopt one of the steps.
I guess that's a really important lesson for other people in other wherever they are in the world, is to remember that there are different levels of government, and it's not about getting something over the line at even a national or state level, that you've got to keep up that campaign and get things over the line at a really local level as well until you get the momentum.
Yeah, I mean, I've done presentations on this to different audiences, and I think we're a bit unique here in BC. We often see the big cities who've got more independence go, like your San Franciscos, your New Yorks, your Vancouvers, do great leadership work. And then the rest seems to be left up to the state or the province or the national level. Whereas I think here in BC, we've recognized that Vancouver only makes up 10%, about 10, 12% of the population here. So if we're just relying on Vancouver, there's 90% of action that's happening that's not being targeted. And those areas are able to, all they can do is to build to base code. And so, what we've been doing as a utility is in investing in capacity in those, large, medium size municipalities or the very small ones.
Yeah.
Like this, sorry, or the champion small ones, I should say.
Right.
So even though there's about 189 municipalities here in BC, we just, our partnerships are heavily invested in the largest, like 15 to 20, and then they're able to provide leadership to the smaller ones, or those other ones. So yeah, I think that the local government, leaning on local government leadership, especially those medium-sized ones that are sometimes aren't as high profile as your large ones, provides terrific opportunity to be able to test and drive forward codes that maybe could be a bit challenging for the very small places which don't have the capacity.
I like that idea of the champion regions, focusing on those ones that really are making that change, not necessarily massive ones. Who are you aware of that's following your lead? Are there other places that are doing similar type of roadmap codes that are looking at that stepped change over a period of time?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're not unique in this idea. As I say, elsewhere in North America, they call it more like the stretch code. So I think they've done it in Massachusetts and other places down in the States. Here in Canada, we have a national, they called it a tier code rather than step code, but same idea, and leaning heavily on the lessons that we have here in BC. So that's getting worked on. So yeah, I think that idea of providing that clarity for builders around where code is going, and then again for utilities and others who are offering incentives to lock into, I think that's becoming a more embraced idea.
Yeah, I mean, I could almost flip that question around and say, why isn't everyone doing it? Because it looks, sounds, and is so obvious once you see all the benefits. Why do you think that it's not being up? This approach isn't being taken up in pretty much everywhere, or are there ways that you're starting to see that happen now?
I'd say that it's the fact that we're using performance-based code has allowed us to give out that roadmap in a clearer way. Like when you're talking about prescriptive codes about what you should be including in buildings, it's much more difficult to work out, well, what would you include in a building that was 20% or 40% or 80%? Whereas if you're just looking at the outcome of actually how that building's performing, then it just ends up being like a small table that you can slide into the code. So it's much more easy to put into place. Now, when that's the case, you absolutely need to be investing in, the compliance side, the modeling side, all that capacity building that we've been focusing on. But I think from a codes direction perspective, it's probably much more simple than all the prescriptive codes that could be. I think the one that we were referring to here in BC for homes was like 140 pages. So really challenging to do compliance work with such a complicated code, and also challenging to portray what that would look like in many years to come. So I think most of the high performance building certifications, like Energy Star, like Built Green, like Passive House, they're performance based. I think that's been very helpful for our codes development too.
Yeah. So just to finish off with, any tips for people who are wanting to initiate something if this type of, not just the performance-based, but also a roadmap approach doesn't exist? What would you say is the starting point for someone to get that off the ground if nothing like it is in place?
Yeah, for sure. So, I did quite a lot of thinking about that, which is, what we put into this document called Lessons from the BC Energy Step Code, which really told our story about how the Step Code came about for us. And then I went over to Nova Scotia and did a workshop with that jurisdiction. And the fundamental sort of base grounding is to know your industry, know what capacity you have, know who your leaders are within your jurisdiction, because I believe there's leaders in every industry group, whether it's architects, engineers, planners, building officials, who want to see better quality buildings and who can report out on the buildings that they're building, often voluntarily to a far higher standard. And getting them talking and being leaders with their own member organizations around what's happening in their jurisdiction. So we did a bit of a scan in Nova Scotia where we had a workshop where we talked about the stories of what had happened in BC and sort of how our stuff had come about. But then before that workshop, had done a survey with these sort of leading organizations within Nova Scotia and said, like, where are you at? Like, where are your pain points? Where are you excelling at? Like, they'd done way more than us, for example, on heat pumps from a market penetration perspective. So they were leading from us in some ways, and then they had lessons from us in another. But I think that it's identifying those leaders, those champions within your organizations who you can partner with to be able to bring about that change. And there's one other thing that I would note about a weakness of the STEP code is that it is an energy performance code. It's not a carbon performance code. And so it's something that a lot of local governments have been had some angst over from the beginning. Like, they wanted to put carbon metrics into the STEP code. It didn't get in the first time around, but now we're working on getting those carbon metrics like Vancouver has into their code. We're calling it greenhouse gas intensity metrics as well as energy use intensity. So I think that's an important thing. If people are looking at codes and how they can update and modify and modernize their codes, if you're looking at it from a climate action perspective, I don't think it's enough to just look at energy use. I think you also need to explicitly be measuring carbon if that's what you're aiming to reduce.
How do you personally feel about the future
of codes?
Of what you've created and contributed to, particularly in the building industry?
I mean, I think it's been a wonderful experience working with all of the stakeholders and partners that we have here in BC. It's so encouraging to see that everyone wants to do the right thing. The question is, how can we do it in an affordable, reasonable fashion? But the bigger question is, how can we do this in the speed that that government is leaning on us to be able to meet carbon requirements? And I think the new construction is definitely the easiest sector to look at. We're now looking in BC at the alteration code for existing buildings, or an alteration code for existing buildings, and that's obviously way more challenging. But if we're looking at the building sector and how to reduce carbon overall, we need to be looking at that existing building sector. And we look at places like New York. I know you were interviewing Tom about what they're doing with their carbon caps and carbon requirements for existing buildings. We're looking at the same thing. Vancouver is taking a leadership role again, but it's a tough nut to crack.
That is a tough one.
It's something that we need to be really focusing on to be able to look at the transformation that's being required of us from these targets.
I very much look forward to having you back to talk about how you've cracked that nut and looking at a step code for performance targets of the transition of existing building stock, because again, that is something that is relevant around the whole world to all jurisdictions, wherever people are, wherever there are buildings. That you're right, it's hard work, but it's the challenge that's out there.
For sure.
Awesome. Hey, well, thank you very much for your time, Robyn. I really appreciate it. And for all your work and contribution to this, as well as all the other people that you've mentioned that have been part of this. And yeah, I just want to highlight that it has rippled out well beyond British Columbia. I mean, I'm in Auckland. I've heard about it. I'm inspired by it. So it's definitely making waves well beyond what you've just done locally. And I think that's part of what we're trying to do with Accelerate as well, is spread the message beyond just our one or two projects.
That's great. Thanks so much for having me.
And that was Robyn Wark from BC Hydro talking about why and how people should buy less of the product that they sell, which is energy. What did you take out of that second time around, Zach?
Well, I mean, even better the second time around, and super relevant. So when this Encore episode is published on Monday, we will also be reading the new IPCC report, this big report that will be coming out documenting the severity of the climate crisis. And so when we think about how to respond to that, I think it's going to be a bit of a gut punch as far as I understand. We're looking for solutions, and in the built environment, this notion of a step code that can move us toward passive house in a rational and predictable and achievable way in a short period of time is really important. So I think this re-listen comes at a really good time.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that, like I said, it's obvious after the fact, but Robyn and the team that she worked with have made that the case. With regards to building codes, there's a few things. Firstly, the step code is performance-based. And that sounds simple, but it's fundamental and fundamentally different from a lot of codes that have either been designed or become prescriptive. And then they get really, really complicated because they have to say how to do everything. A performance-based code says what the outcome should be, what the performance should be. And it's relatively simple then, and you just totally open up to the market to provide the solutions. You can build whatever you like as long as it achieves those performance outcomes. It's a fundamental shift, and it's really important. It's a big part of the step code, and I think is a really good roadmap for other codes around the world. The second part of the step code is that it's a forecast. It's very predictable. It doesn't leave people wondering what's going to happen every 2 years. Are we going to require different standards or different materials? It just lays out for the next decade or longer where things are going. And that allows market forces to do their thing as well. So it's a very, open market kind of mechanism for improving the way things are going. I actually heard about a parallel topic to this was the introduction of electric vehicles. Just this week, I think some of the really big manufacturers made announcements which are way ahead of the rules and regulations that Europe first put in place to say, I think by 2035, they're going to start restricting internal combustion engines. A lot of the manufacturers have come out and said, well, we're going to produce all our electric cars, I think Jaguar said, by 2025.
Right.
And it's very, very similar. You know, once the writing's on the wall, then it makes economic sense for manufacturers and people in the industry to actually move faster.
Agreed. Actually, there's a new report out from the Carbon Tracker Institute that talks about the positive feedback loops that can accelerate the transition. And one of the drivers of that, of course, will also be our growing alarm about the crisis and the need to. So there's the market forces that are making this make sense, these transitions make sense, as well as this inevitable policy response that will come as more and more of us become aware of the crisis.
Yeah. And just finally, I also want to talk about the market and marketing, and Robyn's point in there about originally it was called a stretch code, which sounds painful.
Right.
It's like it's going to hurt. It's a subtle change, but an important one. And part of that strategy of communicating what you want to achieve out to a broader audience and making that more appealing, basically. And I think that's something that we all need to think about, is how we make our message attractive rather than something that sounds really scary and expensive and painful.
Right. This is right. It's just step by step. This is not Herculean. You just,
Yeah.
you can just one foot in front of the other.
Awesome. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that the second time around as much as I did. We've got some more great interviews to bring you again during the month of August. But there's also a bunch of other stuff still going on out there.
There is. This is going to be a packed fall. So I just want to remind folks that we have major events from the International Passive House Institute, the Passive House Canada, FIAS, and the South Pacific Passive House community. So starting with the 25th International Passive House Conference, that'll happen September 10th and 11th. And then again, there's an online only portion that will happen, I think on the 14th and 15th. We'll have details in show notes. The Tower Retrofit Symposium from Passive House Canada will be September 22nd and 23rd, excuse me. FIASCon, the FIAS conference will be October 12th through 15th. The South Pacific Passive House Conference will be November 25th through 27th. So all of these events are available online. I think most of them are also in person. And so we will share details about all of them. There's also the Passive House Maine Fall Forum that will be going on, conferences from Nessie. So September and October and also November are going to be packed with great events and information sharing and knowledge sharing from these fine institutions.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Thank you again to our sponsors, and thank you for listening into this special Encore episode. We'll be back again next week with another feature interview on the Passive House podcast.